Be merciful to me, O Lord, for you are my God. I call upon you all the day long. Amen. Given all that has been happening in this country in the last few weeks around racism and injustice, it's pretty amazing, isn't it, that the reading from the Old Testament for today, 2 days after Juneteenth, involves Hagar and Sarah, a black slave woman and her mistress. Earlier this week, as I was marveling about that fact, I remembered a conversation that I had maybe 18 years ago. I was in my early 40s and back in school, commuting from the small town in rural north central Pennsylvania to the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, which is way down in the southeast corner of the state. Driving across Interstate 80 through rolling farmland up into the Poconos and then down the northeast extension into Philly's northern suburbs. Conshohocken, Plymouth Meeting, Tony, Chestnut Hill, and then under the railroad tracks into sketchy Germantown. Each week, I'd spend a couple of days there, going to class, eating in the dining hall, and studying in the library, and then go back to my real life, squeezing reading and writing assignments into the normal friends and family stuff. I was testing out this idea of seminary, and I was in heaven. So one day after class, some women were talking about womanist theology. Now, I'd done some tiptoeing around in feminist theology, enough to know that it wasn't a monolith. In fact, we might have just come out of a class in mujerista theology, which is theology that rises out of the experience of Latinas. But what was this? I asked one of my classmates, who was black. She said, it's from the perspective of women like us. And I said, really? I like that. I like the sound of that. Maybe I could be a womanist. And I'll never forget the look in her eyes. Like she knew she had to be nice to me. And at the same time, like just so tired of it. She said, well, it's doing theology out of black women's experience. She wasn't unkind, just frustrated. I imagine she was thinking, here's another white woman who has no idea what whiteness is. With her nice clothes and her expensive car and no need for financial aid, a white woman who is free to move between worlds without fear, secure in her good intentions and her liberal outlook. Here's another white woman assuming that what is mine is hers, too. Fast forward 10 years. I'm ordained and have worked for a while, and I'm now back in the academy and thinking about women's voices in preaching when I pick up Just a Sister Away, published in 1988 by Renita Weems, B.A. Wellesley, Ph.D., Princeton. The subtitle is A Womanist Vision of Women's Relationships in the Bible, and of course, she begins with Hagar and Sarah. So remember last week, Sarah and Abraham, her husband, have entertained 3 visitors, one of whom promises that within a year Sarah would give birth to a son. She thought that was pretty hilarious because she wasn't just past childbearing age, she was ancient. Yes, God promised long ago that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the heavens. But as the years have gone by without even a hint of a child, Sarah had decided to help God along. She had given her Egyptian slave girl, Hagar, to Abraham as a surrogate. Since Hagar was Sarah's, Hagar's child would also belong to Sarah. Sarah's plan had worked, but you can imagine what happened to the relationship between the two women. For Sarah, the sight of Hagar's baby bump was a painful reminder of her own empty womb, which, in spite of her economic and social power as the wife of a man of property, rendered her in that culture an object of pity and scorn. And for Hagar, who was poorer than poor, no more than chattel, suddenly she had something. She was something. And that felt pretty good. When Sarah complained about Hagar to Abraham, he just shrugged and told her that she should do what she needed to do with her slave. Mind you, not the woman in his household who was carrying his child, her slave. Well, Sarah made things so awful that pregnant Hagar ran away. The angel of the Lord came looking for her in the wilderness, and it was there that Hagar received her promise of descendants. It was there that she was given the name for her son, Ishmael, which means God hears. It was there that she was so bold as to name God from her experience, which makes her the first womanist theologian. You are El Roy, she said, which means you are God who sees. And then she did what the angel told her to do. She went back and had her baby. Later, miraculously, Sarah finally conceives and gives birth to Isaac, meaning laughter. Remember how Sarah had laughed, which sets up the scene in today's text from Genesis that Catherine read. It could have been, it should have been a sweet moment. Two boys in the same household, brothers, playing together, laughing. Once again, Sarah is threatened by this other woman and her child. Once again, she goes to Abraham and demands that he do something about it, only this time, having received God's promise that Ishmael will survive, Abraham says, okay, I'll get rid of them. Now, up to this point, in Dr. Weems' treatment of Sarah and Hagar's story in her book, she has been unfailingly sympathetic and compassionate in her renderings of both of these women and the ways in which each was victimized by power structures and cultural norms, even as she draws out the haunting parallels with Black women's experience in this country and shared some of her own. But here, at this point, is where she unpacks so powerfully the tragedy in this story that we, or at least I, had overlooked, and its legacy of suffering that continues to this day. Before God was forced to intercede on the slave woman's behalf, she writes, meaning before God went and found Hagar and Ishmael weeping as they prepared to die in the wilderness, there was a woman who could have made a difference in Hagar's situation. One word from Sarah that afternoon could have made a difference in Hagar's story. Sarah must have been watching as Abraham packed Hagar and Ishmael up and sent them off. And Sarah could have stopped it. If only she could have found a way to see past her own pain and resentment toward this slave woman of hers that she herself had exploited, and past her fear of this child who might somehow, some way take something from her son, which presumes a zero-sum game, and prevent her husband's dispatching these two vulnerable members of his household into a dangerous and probably unsurvivable place. If only Sarah might have realized that were she and Hagar able to see beyond their enmity and regard one another not as rivals for scarce resources, but rather as women who could support one another, that could have somehow been there for one another, sisters on the same side struggling together for justice and for the flourishing of all. If only. But she didn't. She couldn't. She was too stuck in that mindset of protecting me and mine that is sadly so instinctive. It was too hard to let go of her fear and find room in her heart for mercy. She stood by and let them go. Dr. Weems goes on to say, at some time in all of our lives, and she is presuming an audience of women here, whether we are black or white, we are all Hagar's daughters. When our backs are up against a wall, when we feel abandoned, abused, betrayed, and banished, when we find ourselves in need of another woman's help, a friend, a neighbor, a colleague, a relative, a stranger, we, like Hagar, are in need of a woman who will sister us. In those times, we are frequently just a sister away from our healing. Just a sister away. When I think about what it means to be anti-racist, it occurs to me that this construal of relationship between not just women, but all of us, whatever our race, ethnicity, gender identity, or economic status, this construal may well be a way forward. If only you and I can regard one another not as competitors, but kin, who are for one another, who are on one another's side, who have one another's backs. If we can claim that frame, if we can operate from that place, there is the possibility that we can find our way through this incredibly difficult reckoning and come out on the other side. We can have hope. And so, with deepest respect, I say to that woman outside of that class so long ago, what's yours is not automatically mine. I'm trying to know that. I understand the limits of my seeing. But please, may we learn from the theological brilliance of Black women who have made a way where there is no way. May I say today to myself and all of us that the work of justice and peacemaking and healing begins just a sister away, just a brother away, just a sibling away. When we dig deep into our hearts and find the compassion and mercy of which we are all so desperately in need. In the name of God who hears and the name of God who sees. Amen.